Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this panel today, Philanthropic Support for Journalism that Aligns with Foundation Program and Priority Areas. I'm Nina Sachdev. I'm the Director of Communications for Media Impact Funders, which is a network of funders who support journalism and documentary film and other forms of media in the public interest. I am joined by three funders today. To my immediate right is Kayce Ataiyero, the Chief External Affairs Officer at the Joyce Foundation. Vidya Krishnamurthy, who's the Chief Communications Officer at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. And then to my far right is Sam Gill, the President and CEO of the Doris Duke Foundation. So just to begin, just to kind of set the stage for this conversation, I know that there are a lot of people in this room who are eager to understand how philanthropy approaches funding their work. Understanding how funding strategies are shaping the journalism landscape, especially given the moment that we're in, is really essential for journalists and media organizations who are looking to build successful partnerships with foundations. It's very important that you understand how to frame your work and the importance of your work as it relates to philanthropic goals. And so I'm always a huge fan of peeling back the curtain to help us all understand how philanthropy works. I think I actually said this, maybe this exact line last year at this table in this seat for the panel that I moderated last year. It's important to understand how funders make decisions because that makes our collective work stronger. And so this is going to be a panel where you get lots of time to ask questions, because I know that you probably will have a lot of questions, and the funders on this panel today are very eager to answer them. So just so you all understand, some of you might know this, but some of you might not, the majority of funders who are supporting this work are doing so through their program area. And this support for media aligns with their programmatic objectives at each of their foundations. And you know, there are very few funders who have existing portfolios organized around funding for journalism and media. Now, you will be hearing from one funder, Kayce Ataiyero, who does have a dedicated media portfolio, but that wasn't always the case, and she'll tell us that story. And so I want to start by asking each of you, Kayce, Vidya, and Sam, to share how your foundations think about journalism and media, how you support journalism and media, how it's showing up across all of your program areas, and how you're viewing journalism as a tool to reach your broader foundation objectives. So Kayce, we'll start with you. You've had, I think, quite an evolution in your media funding journey. Can you unpack that for us?
Sure, thank you, Nina, and it's so great to be here with you guys at my first IJF. It's been a really great week of really important conversations about advancing the work. So as Nina said, I work for the Joyce Foundation. We are a regional funder that funds within the Great Lakes states in the U.S., primarily public policy, research, advocacy, and education. And I started the foundation about 7 years ago in a primarily communications-focused role. And one thing that comms folks try to do is to get the word out about the work. And I realized that one of the biggest barriers to doing so was the contraction of the news business. And that, you know, when you're trying to get the word out about public policy, when you're trying to educate and inform and hopefully build coalitions of support around seeding public policy solutions, you need journalists to help you tell their story, to help tell their story, and to importantly interrogate the ideas, right? Like to stress test the ideas to make sure that we're heading in the right direction with the work. But, you know, the State House coverage had been decimated. You know, public policy, subject matter expertise have been decimated in newsrooms. And so we really set about thinking about how we could help to repopulate the ranks of public policy reporters. Joyce has funded journalism somewhat ad hoc for many, many years. I mean, I look back and we funded our local our local National Public Radio outlet, WBZ, going back to like the late 80s. And the programs funded discrete journalism-related projects as they supported their programmatic goals. But it was really thinking about how could we be more strategic, put a real frame around a program that would look to, again, at first, really rebuild the ranks of public policy reporters, but then as the program grew, how can we help to support the broader media ecosystem? Because we just saw, like, as the contractions continued to grow, as the turbulence continued to grow, we realized that, you can't build a house on a shaky foundation, right? And so how could we in our role help to strengthen the broader regional media ecosystem in our area? And so that's what the program that I oversee seeks to do. Again, with a heavy focus on public policy, heavy focus on nonprofit media, even though we do fund some for-profit media. And I wanted to put a plug in for support of for-profit media in particular, because a lot of, when we talk about diversity in media, it's important to not exclude our for-profit partners, particularly because a lot of ethnic community-based media are for-profit media outlets. And so it is important for us to look holistically, like, again, like, for-profit status, nonprofit status is not, it's a tax status, it's not a business model, and it certainly doesn't, I think, sort of denote the value of the work or the importance of the work or the public service aspect of the work. So I'll leave it there and give Vidya an opportunity to chime in.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks for having me in this panel. So I'm at the Hewlett Foundation, where I'm the Chief of Communications and Strategic External Engagement. Hewlett is a philanthropy that has been around for almost 60 years. We work on a variety of issue areas. Locally, in the West Coast of the U.S., we focus on performing arts. Across the U.S., which is where most of our funding focuses, we work on issues like education, U.S. democracy. And internationally, some of our funding includes work to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change, to promote gender equity and inclusive governance. So we work at very different geographies. All of those programs, many of which we've been funding in for decades, have specific outcomes that we're pursuing. The program priorities are, trying to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, or trying to ensure that all kids have great educational experiences. I think we have never styled ourselves as a journalism funder, but even in the first few years when the foundation was established, one of the first grants was to public media. And I think that's in part, there's something in the DNA of the organization. The people who work there, the people who founded it, were heavy news consumers. They were people who cared about information and understanding the world. And so I think over time, organically, there have always been some media grants in each of our program areas. And very similar to the story that Kayce tells, I think in the last several years, the realization, the experience, not just of the program staff, but also of the other grantees in the space, responding to changes in the information ecosystem where it's harder to get your story out. If you're trying to solve a problem, you need to have a robust public square where you can talk about issues, where people who have different ideas about how to solve a problem want to have their voices heard. And so, we spend most of our time working with like policy organizations, think tanks, researchers, and those are all folks who are struggling to make sure that facts and ideas and thoughtful arguments are understood. And the role of journalism in that is so important. So I think it's almost a response that in recent years we've started to have more media grants. I think the really important thing is what we have tried to do with some of that work is take the lessons of effective philanthropy. So I think the lessons we've learned over many decades of giving are, the importance of long-term giving, flexible funding, relationships based in trust. That's how we think about working with folks who are delivering services, folks who are doing other things in the community, whether they're artists or educators. And what I think has been really important to me and my team, many of whom are former journalists, is to ensure that program staff, many of whom are not former journalists, is to ensure that we bring that same spirit of trust to relationships with journalism entities, which is, I think, critically important for maintaining the editorial independence, the work that journalists care the most about. So while at the program level, we have some kind of larger outcomes, when we're working with an individual grantee, it's really all about what matters most to you, what are you trying to achieve? So that's what I'd share.
Thank you. Sam?
Yeah, I just want to echo thanks to you, Nina, for having us here, Vince, for having us here, and Media Impact Funders. Thank you all for being here. Happy belated Liberation Day for those of you that haven't had a chance to celebrate yet. Tough crowd. All right. Look, we suspended most of the tariffs. Doris Duke Foundation is a $2 billion private foundation working to build a more creative, equitable, sustainable future. We work across a variety of issue areas, principally in arts and culture, in nature and conservation, and in health and well-being. I used to work at the Jonas and James L. Knight Foundation, so I can draw on that experience as well over the course of this conversation. You know, I'll make a sort of a general comment and then talk a little bit about Doris Duke today. But I think the general comment will frame, I think, some of the other contributions I might make in this conversation. You know, if you think of the private national foundations in the United States, you should think of them as distinct from kind of local charity. And really the role of private national foundations in their existence since the beginning of the 20th century is to serve as sort of marginal social innovation capital. And I think the role of that marginal social innovation capital, it was best expressed by Kate Ladd Macy, who founded the Josiah Macy Foundation, when she said, like, the real contributions of foundations are to develop new ideas. So I think that the investments that we make are about new ideas about what problems matter in the society, about the nature of those problems, about what to do about those problems. And that process, for most of the history of organized philanthropy, benefited from a very stable information ecology, certainly in the United States, but probably broadly across kind of liberal democracies and advanced economies. And that information ecology was stable curatorially and also economically. And that information ecology, I think, played, you know, at least two roles that are really useful to foundations. One is that they produced verified information, which is a really important force in social change, but they also produced rationally argued persuasive information, or provided a medium for that. That's obviously changed a lot. And so, you know, similar to Joyce and to Hewlett, you know, programs at Doris Duke Foundation in recent years have increasingly made instrumental investments in journalism and journalism projects, in part to compensate for that loss and to try to replace that substrate of rational argumentation and verified information in some of our areas. Another thing that our programs have done, also instrumentally, is to think about the ways in which that curatorial role is migrating out of legacy media organizations. So, for example, we have a longstanding program that's focused on kind of bridging cultural, sort of addressing social polarization through the prism of U.S. Muslims. Doris Duke had a real interest in global Muslim cultures and arts in her lifetime. And in the early days of the program, like in the early 2000s, there were lots of grants to media organizations to kind of tell the story of different Muslim communities. Now we make many more grants for narrative fiction projects or different genres of nonfiction like stand-up comedy and things like that, because they're playing that curatorial role, but in places where audiences are, in modalities that audiences are receptive to. The sort of last piece, if you think about that as a kind of unbundling of the curatorial role of media organizations in a democracy, I think the new frontier is foundations actually undertaking operational programs to replace some of that or to provide new forms of that. So more and more foundations are pursuing activities that look like content creation. And I think that we see and I could talk more about this as we get into it with some examples, but I think we certainly see ourselves as having a sense of loyalty to the pro-social, the pro-democratic curatorial role of journalism as an institution. So those would be sort of a few trends that I've certainly seen in our work.
And Sam, you've said before that grant makers have a bunch of tools at their disposal, and grant making is just one of them. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on some comments you made in our planning call about Sure. like what some of the other superpowers are?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, my sense is a lot of organizations are organized around the thing that gets made, so, for people who worked in, a press room who are due for a physical newspaper, like my guess is that sort of the production of the newspaper drives a lot of the logic of the place. This is true. Apple is really focused on like who's designing the iPhone more than the other departments. I think foundations historically, the grant acts as the product. It's the discrete thing that you make. And again, in a really stable information environment, in a relatively stable civil society, I think the grant was appropriately nearly the exclusive tool of social change for foundations. Again, it's sort of an independent reservoir of capital for new ideas. The idea landscape has really changed. Some of that is as a result of all of the things we lament, in these various panels at conferences like this, but some of that's the result of really important changes in the society. In the 1940s, the people who were making decisions at foundations about which grants to make went to college with the people who were making decisions about commerce went to college with the people who were running government. It's really good that that's changed. The problems that we seek to address have become more complex as well. So I think you're in a more fractious, complicated, multimodal information ecosystem in which you're trying to transmit these ideas. And I think if you think of the idea as the product, then there are other tools that might be on the table. Now, I don't think the opportunity for foundations is to try to do things we can't be good at. I think that in roles as a convener, I think in roles as a thought leader, I think in roles as a content creator, we're going to have some strengths and some areas of competence, and then we're going to have some other areas where we need to work with and rely on other organizations. And we never want to forget, that even if all of our investments in civil society are instrumental, they benefit from that civil society existing and being strong. And so thinking about what our role can be in supporting the fundamental integrity of that civil society will always be important. But I think that there is no going back. I think that you're going to see foundations will increasingly use a variety of tools, and the most effective foundations will use those tools in unique combinations that only they are able to apply.
Thank you. Vidya, it looked like you wanted to get in there.
No, I just wanted to kind of build on the key point that I think Sam is making here, which is, we're in a fundamentally different information ecosystem, and for foundations like, some of the, like mine and others that have these program priorities, I think a lot of the big questions right now are, what does a healthy information ecosystem look like? And who are the people who need to be resourced? What are the partners? What are the other tools in the toolkit that we can use? I think convening is a big one for a lot of funders who feel like they can bring together lots of different types of organizations and amplify the voices of the folks that they're supporting. In particular, at Hewlett, for example, we tend to fund fields of organizations, ecosystems of different types of grantees, many of whom disagree with each other. We don't always entirely agree with them because we think that that's a value to bring to kind of the big problems that are facing us. But I think one of the things that I have been really interested in this week's conversations here is how people are grappling with content creators and the importance of verifiable, reported, factual information. And what does this world look like? How do, for us, I think something that we're still learning and grappling with is what is our role as funders to sort of help usher in a different kind of ethic for some of the folks who are content creators and curators who don't have a traditional journalism background, but are playing a role of curating content for audiences. And we don't have the answers on this, but I just think that that's a bigger part of what funders are trying to understand, and many of whom who don't themselves come from media and journalism. So how do you bring the kind of ethical constructs or some traditions of journalism that are really, really important for, I think, rational reasoned debate to the fore. So I would just add that.
Thank you. Kayce, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I did. I think, putting on my former journalist hat, I think it's really important, absolutely echo everything that Sam and Vidya said in terms of thinking about the idea, new ways of meeting people, new vehicles to reach audiences, figuring out where people already are and making those sources better, more credible spaces to get information in. But I think it's critically important that we make a distinction between journalism and storytelling. They are complementary, but not the same thing. And, you know, we do need to find the new now next thing in terms of how we can make journalism more connective, more responsive, more sustainable. But the unsexy bread and butter of journalism still matters, is important, is a core tenet of our democracy. And it's important that we think about ways to make sure that that remains strong. Because we're not going to TikTok our way to the future that we want to be in. And I'm not hating on TikTok, that is not a diss. You know, it is not a diss. I look at it too, there are things that are so entertaining, but you know, again, the sort of sausage making of social change, of social innovation, of sort of rebuilding what is, you know, broken and in deep repair now will require just some of those basic journalism 101 skill sets that are important, that we have to make sure that we foster, that we encourage, that we support.
Sam?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting provocation, and I think it would be worth trying to continue to chase it down. So I think, it seems to me there's no question that there is a task, which is curating information inputs into the world into knowledge that's accurate and that's also relevant, that we'll continue to call journalism. I think that may not look like the form factor that we have even today in a stable way. I think that's an interesting question. I think another interesting question, because I think this distinction between storytelling and journalism is really important. Certainly narrative fiction is not doing the same thing that information verification journalism is. The activity is not the same and the output's not the same. I think that there are kinds of experiences that people that people need in a democracy that used to be fulfilled by journalists in journalism that may not be fulfilled by that unique activity. So for example, you know, if you're reading one of the highbrow news magazines in 40s, 50s, 60s, you're getting exposed to the activity case that you described, but you're also getting exposed to people who are telling stories that are journalistic, intended to expose you to new experiences. They're not intended to give you sort of the facts of the day to make an informed decision, but they are intended to broaden your horizon in a way that I would argue is really important in democracy. That may now be done by things that aren't journalism, for example, right? So Deli Boys, you know, is not journalism, but it might be a better way than certain kinds of journalism or certain kinds of journalistic form factors for broadening someone's horizons about different cultures. So I think like part of, because I really agree with you, the key to making sure the thing called journalism persists is actually to be ahead of these questions and to be asking really critically, where in the democracy is this particular specific activity really needed to achieve the benefit of a society that is informed, of a society that is connected, of a society that feels pathways to engagement in the polity, in the society, and a society in which people see themselves as part of the society.
Well, thank you, Sam. I hope that this is sparking some questions for you, because the ways in which the definitions of journalism are changing and the ways in which foundations are grappling with those changes, I think, is so important for your work. And I think this is a good lead into my next question, which is around evaluation, because impact and evaluation is happening on both sides of this equation. You all are having to track the impact of your investments, and journalists are being asked to document and measure the impact of their journalism, which is a fairly complex endeavor. And so I wonder if you all might just talk about how you're approaching impact of your program area objectives and how journalists should think about approaching their impact. Who wants to start? Vidya?
So I described a little bit how at Hewlett we tend to think about outcomes at sort of the strategy program level. Typically, if we're working with individual grantees, it's a conversation where the grantee says to us, this is what matters most. And the guidance we give our program officers is very much find out what matters to a grantee. that's how you decide. So it's up to you to tell us, and hopefully a good program officer is good at asking smart questions about what matters most to you. We really kind of, I think in part, our approach to grant making means that we're very much looking to understand what is important to the individual organization. So that might be something to do with the financial business model. It might be something to do with technology development. For different kinds of organizations, any number of things, but that's named at the get-go based on what a grantee cares about. That's at the grant by grant level. When we look at a field or a cluster, we're looking at some sort of cumulative thing. So I'll give you an example of that. For about 10 years, we had an initiative that focused on cybersecurity. That's kind of nerdy, wonky thing for like a philanthropy to focus on. And in fact, no other US philanthropy had thought of that as an issue area, but it was something that mattered to us because we saw that big companies were focusing on it and the government was, but civil society and the public interest wasn't being funded by philanthropy, and we thought it was a place where we could come in and do some field building. And that was the intent of the effort. It was 10 years, it was time limited, it was a field building effort. And it became pretty clear to the program officer who was in charge of that a field that was dealing with such complex issues, technical issues, classified information in national security, but also a whole range of citizen concerns around privacy, civil liberties, really needed to have an element of a translation infrastructure and dissemination, otherwise known as journalism, media, communication. And it was a small sliver of the overall funding stream, but we funded, journalists, news organizations, training programs, events where reporters could come and get sourced and meet other folks. It was a smaller segment of the overall piece of the funding, but it definitely punched above its weight. That at the end of the 10 years, you could say there were organizations that kind of got the seed funding and were up and running in and of themselves, and will continue to sort of provide a public good beyond the end. So that's an example of how it was really up to the individual grantee to define, but we're looking at the initiative as a whole. Was there a real robust field at the end of that investment?
Kayce?
Sure. We are still, in terms of hard metrics, figuring out what numbers make sense. Because, as you all know, trying to pin down, I'll date myself, but as a old school newspaper reporter, right, circulation was king, right? And that's how you knew. And that's why we didn't care how many papers people took when they put their quarter in the honor box, because we could count that circulation, right? Today, it's hard to know, right? It's hard to know what hard number means that, you're penetrating and building audience in an important way. So, I think we sort of broadly look at relevance and resonance, right? For the outlets that we fund that are more focused on the public policy piece, how do they connect to people who are in a position to move the needle on public policy? Are they the go-to outlet for legislators, policy analysts, the like? Are they reaching that audience? That's one thing we look at. And then for our more community-based news outlets, are they connecting to community? When we're out in the community, do people talk about them? Are people going to their events? Do you get a sense that they really are plugged in and know the communities that they cover? And that's soft, you can't really put a number on that. But, if you're in an Uber and I'm asking the guy what he reads, and he goes on for, 15 minutes about this article he read in Block Club Chicago, that tells me, right, that they're hitting the mark.
Sam, did you want to add something?
I can. I think, I just as a general matter, I don't have the highest opinion of the work foundations make a lot of people do on the evaluation side. At Knight Foundation, I tried to get the grant report down to, did you do what you said you would do, yes or no? I do care that the program officer has an idea. I got close for anyone who's a recent Knight grantee. I don't know if they've changed it since. I got it down to on a scale of 1 to 5, did you do what you said you would do? I think, I think the essence of, in my mind, effective social investing is not giving someone money to do your thing. It's giving them money to do their thing that happens to benefit your thing, which may be a different thing. And so I'm interested in whether a program officer has a theory of what this investment in journalism is meant to do, and that may mean asking the grantee some questions. You know, I think if you're running, whether it's a legacy media organization or a startup media organization or a startup reporting project, in this environment, you're working your butt off every day to try to figure out what makes you essential to your audience. So, you know, my first comment would be a question, which is, a lot has happened in the last decade around new reporting experiments, new media experiments. Are we learning something new, to Kayce's point, about the proxies that correlate to financial success? Are we learning something new about the proxies that correlate to audience growth and engagement? Are we learning something new about the proxies that might correlate to the impact of journalism on a liberal democracy? That's what investing in new ideas looks like. Those are the new ideas. And so I think we should be interested, not as an evaluative matter, in the kinds of answers that are percolating in the field. I think, you know, from there, I really do think it's the work of a program officer to figure out, and I think we got great examples. You know, I have nothing to add. I think really good program officers should have a theory of the kind of social change they think the foundation is contributing to, and they should have a theory of what the role of media is in a broader field within that. And if they don't, I really shouldn't be delegating it to you guys. So.
I'll take questions in 1 minute. I think that this is like funder gold right here. I mean, this is such a good opportunity to hear how funders are thinking about their internal operations. And so I want to ask a question that's somewhat related to that, which is, what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions that journalists and news organizations have about how funders operate? Because this whole session is about kind of like breaking down the walls between you know, these two sides and fostering greater understanding. Who wants to tackle that one first?
I can go.
Okay.
One of the biggest ones I find is sort of a skepticism and mistrust and thinking that it's a pay-to-play situation. And I'm not going to say that that is never the case, but I think, you know, you have funders like the ones, you know, on the stage, like many, who deeply believe in the core role of journalism as a key pillar of democracy and fund it as such. And so, you know, when I talked before about, you know, wanting to repopulate the ranks of public policy reporters, because as a comms person, there was no one to pitch to, I wasn't trying to get Joyce's story told. I was trying to get the story of the work told and the stories of our grantees told. And so I think sometimes there is an unnecessary reticence to engage because they think that it might be pay to play, or the cost will be too high. And I certainly get that, particularly, you know, come all of the benevolent billionaires that were supposed to save the industry, and look where we are. So I get that. But I would just say, you know, come to it in an open mind with the idea that this is a mutually beneficial opportunity to seed some really important work that could help community and society.
Vidya or Sam?
I mean, a few that maybe are I hope are relevant. You know, I think one that I want to return to, you know, again, this is sort of private, independent foundations, not foundations in community or community charity. You know, it really isn't sufficient capital to keep the lights on in any field. It's not. I think that funders aid and abet this misconception. I think we like to think sometimes that we're sustaining capital, that we're essential to fields. We're not, and we can't be. So, you know, that's number one. And 1B is the resources really are scarce, you know, at the level of, like any investor, across all the different decisions one has to make. That's one misconception. I think a second misconception is I hear more discussion about the sort of asymmetry between funders and grantees than I do in any other investing class. And again, I think this is one we aid and abet because, it's really nice to feel like you're important and needed. But the reality is, like, we're capital looking for a socially productive use. Grantees are socially productive uses looking for capital. We need each other. The proximate source of stress for most of the folks who work at Doris Duke Foundation we also operate some centers, but on the kind of grant making side is finding great grantees. They're desperate to find great grantees. And so I think it could be, a relationship that feels much more reciprocal and symmetrical than it does. Again, we have a lot of work to do. We're contributing to these misconceptions. The third misconception, I think, and again, this is one that we contribute to, is the funder is not the grantee graduated to some higher plane of existence. We have a different job. We're an investor, not an operator. So what we know about, or should know about, and I think, again, my co-panelists have articulated this really well, is sort of what the topography of a whole field might look like. What we know something about is who is in a better position to succeed over a period of time, potentially. What we might know something about is how to bring interesting people, projects, and places together into combination, sometimes working with each other, sometimes in a portfolio where they're doing different things that conduce to some larger social change. We're not an operator, and we shouldn't be second-guessing operators. We should ask really tough questions of operators. Any investor should. But I think this is a misconception we contribute to. The reason that I mention these three misconceptions is they don't serve us either. So, like, here's my pact with you. I'll do my part, in reducing how much we contribute to these misconceptions if you do your part, and then hopefully, together we'll create a source of philanthropic capital that I'm still proud to be a part of, but that could be even more effective than it is today.
Vidya, do you want to add anything?
I don't really have too much to add because they're so great. I'm going to say
that's a great contribution.
So great, so great. I think I'm gonna say two very quick things. The first is there are a lot of people in philanthropy who don't actually really know what journalists do or what newsrooms need. So, and this is true for lots and lots of other types of industries and organizations that philanthropists try to support. So I think the misconception is thinking that the program officer or the funder on the other side knows a lot about what you do. They don't necessarily. So I would just say, tell your own best story. The other thing, and at Hewlett, we're unusual this way. We have term limits for our program officers and program directors. So if your job is substantially grant making, on your first day what your last day is going to be. And there's no re-upping or anything like that. It's and most of the people who we recruit are from the field, so they do sometimes know something about the fields in which we invest, and they usually go back. So we like this because it creates dynamism and it creates a certain degree of humility. But I think the other important part of that is that it's a back and forth conversation all the time, and it's just really important to hold that because you know your best story, you are your best advocate. So make sure you tell that great story. So I think that's just a really important thing for folks to know. And then the other thing is, I spent most of my career on the other side of the checkbook. And I think the challenge is always when you kind of get off your game or your core mission because there's a funder who persuades you to take on some project that has, doesn't cover your true costs, doesn't pay for your overhead, and you kind of get off your game. And I know that's so hard when resources are so scarce, but it just does not contribute to a resilient organization. And those are just challenges that I think on both sides of that equation we need to really be honest about. So,
thank you. Those are really great insights. We're eager to take your questions. You raised your hand first. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Fernando Morales de la Cruz. I'm a journalist that has dedicated the last 11 years of my life only on investigating violations of children's rights by corporations and businesses. And sadly, it's a huge problem. And my main frustration is that most of the journalists I've talked to, and I can name all of them one day, they say, I'm so sorry, we cannot publish that. Our advertisers, our investors, our funders, at the foundation that gives us grants. So, because foundations are supposed to exist for the common good, And we have a really serious problem in society. In the United States, where I actually studied, there are 1 million children working, but there are tens of millions of children working for the United States. And in Europe, we have the same problem. Here in Europe, in Italy, we have 336,000 children working, but we have tens of millions of children working for the European Union. So my question to you funders, because you are extremely well-known foundations, is can journalists be funded when they are actually investigating corporations to the point that they have to say, I'm very sorry, but we found out that this corporation has 3 million children, and we've documented it with photographers and investigative journalists? Is there hope for that? Because Louis Hine did it 110 years ago, took 10,000 photos in the United States, but ever since then, I cannot name 10 journalists that took 10,000 photos, or even 20. Of children working in supply chains, for example. So specifically, do you believe that, for example, your organizations, because you only talk about your organizations, would fund a Pulitzer Prize photographer to document child labor in California or in Michigan? Because that's the problem, I think.
I mean, I can't obviously speak specifically to that because the two areas that you mentioned are outside of our region. I will say that, I mean, one of the, I think, core ethical tenets of journalism funding is to not try to dictate or control what outlets report. I mean, there have been a number of times when there have been outlets that we fund that have reported things that we didn't like, you know, or reported angles that, you know, and sometimes maybe went counter to some of the work that we fund. And that's not something that we would interfere with. So, and that, I would not, just based on what you said, if there were a story like that in our region, I don't see any reason why we wouldn't support it or would have a problem with something like that being published or produced by an outlet that we support.
Vidya or Sam, did you want to jump in there?
I mean, there are foundations in the United States that fund enterprise reporting that covers things like child labor in the United States. So it's, I mean, it's empirically possible.
Hi, thanks for the panel. I'm from Azerbaijan, small country with 10 million population, part of the Council of Europe, but it's authoritarian country. Now we have 40 journalists in prison, and half of them arrested when President Trump and his administration named USAID as corrupt organizations, and all USAID grantees, half of these my colleagues, they are now arrested because President Aliyev, dictator, said, yes, look, President Trump said they're corrupt because they started investigation project support several years ago. Now their grantees are arrested. My question is, we know the reality is now no more USAID. State Department also cut lots of funds, even a National Endowment for Democracy not able to continue to work. We damaged completely, we are, most of us, exile-based or imprisoned in our countries. Did US private philanthropists have some kind of rapid response or long-term vision how to replace this gap? How to find some kind of alternatives? And do you have some kind of cross-Atlantic cooperation with EU-based private donors? Because we understand you have your own problem already with Trump inside US. Are you able to collaborate and change best practices? How is it possible to support vulnerable groups which is not inside US? Thank you.
Sam?
Thanks for asking this question early, because I think it touches on, you know, kind of the seismic shift of our time. And you know, I showed up this morning and I'm leaving in 24 hours because I'm grappling with this. So it's a really big issue in a lot of fields. Another misconception, and I think it's a widely shared misconception in the US, I don't know other countries, is that civil society is privately financed. In the United States, civil society is not privately financed. It's privately managed. It is mostly federally financed, directly or indirectly. There's a lot of direct, I mean, you gave an example. So much of the work of global civil society, extension of US civil society globally, is directly federally financed. But also, I mean, direct services in the United States are financed through Medicaid reimbursement for direct service organizations that also help to pay the overhead of those direct service organizations. Philanthropy cannot make up that gap. One hope, obviously, is that there will be an opportunity in the next several years to undo as much of this damage as possible. You know, I tend to be of the, I'm in a dark place right now. I tend to be of the camp that like, even if we sort of reinstate funding levels, civil society will just contract anyway, just out of an abundance of caution now. If I were running, if I were a global foreign aid contractor, I wouldn't re-expand, even if contracts were restored, because I would just, at this point, it's been proven to me that funding has become politically volatile. But that's one thing that foundations are obviously investing in, is trying to halt the dismantling of the administrative state and civil society in the U.S. and then hopefully affirmative efforts to replace some of that. You know, we're big funders in science, and you know, we're funding a lot of efforts to sort of restore funding to our National Institutes of Health, which is most of our federal science funding, for example. A second thing that may have to happen is that we will have to figure out what are the small pieces of civil society in the US and abroad that if we lose them, we lose decades, and that also have the potential to innovate their way to the next model. That philanthropy may be able to do. That will be very painful wherever it happens. The thing I would say is, don't leave that task just to philanthropy. You know, now is the time for everybody to be thinking about really critically what is the minimum independent civil society we need, and also who is best positioned to continue to advance that civil society such that it can be effective in the future. Part of how we got here is that liberal institutions of all kinds, journalism, higher ed, whatever, you name it, haven't been working as effectively as they used to. Some of that is the nature of the problems changed. Some of that is that they stopped doing things well that they used to do well. Some of that is that there are longstanding problems we never addressed well through these institutions. But we're going to need different kinds of institutions on the other side. A lot of you are on the front lines of innovating journalism, but we're going to now have to not only try to pursue innovation with scarce resources, we're going to have to try to save what's there, or pieces of what's there with scarce resources, and it will be far worse, I think, if foundations are left to figure out what this should look like. It will be far better if foundations say, here is what we're hearing about what can be a viable bridge to the future. But I can't put a silver lining on this cloud. This is a really challenging time for anyone who believes in the power of an independent society, an independent civil society, and the power of a contemporary administrative and regulatory state.
The only thing I'll add is that, just to underscore Sam's point about the scale of these cutbacks, USAID was what, $40 billion was their budget, and the largest foundation in the U.S. is $9 billion. And
that's endowment versus annual budget.
Right, exactly. That's not actually their annual grant making. I think the other piece of it, we sort of frame this panel as foundations that have kind of program areas that are not fundamentally about journalism. Well, we're seeing those cutbacks in all of the core services in all of those issue areas. The dismantling of the education department for a foundation like ours, that we do support journalists who work on education, because that is so critically important for communities to understand. And like every data source for education statistics in the US, that's largely sitting at the federal government, and it's gone. So how do you report on that? How do you measure on that? How do you think about improvements on that? So it's a huge set of dominoes, because the next set of dominoes is we're, by no ambition of our own, we're the largest funder of the performing arts in the Bay Area. It's mainly because other like tech funders and stuff don't do that. And with federal cutbacks, it's going to have this knock-on effect on the California state budget, which is going to have to take on more services, which means something like performing arts, which the federal government doesn't do a whole lot with, but the state does. The state's going to probably cut back. So it is. The need is so vast on so many different fronts, and there's no good story to tell here, except that I think that philanthropy, it means for love of humanity. I think everybody who works there in a philanthropy has a fundamentally optimistic view that progress is possible, and that we have to be able to think about what does something on the other side of this. Climate change is still happening. Kids still need to be educated. People still need to know what's going on. We're going to have to just keep pushing on, and what the future looks like, I don't really know, except that there are people who care about getting there.
Well, just to add something quick, I think that you bring up data sets. So this is good. that's how deep of a subsidy this is. So it's not just that the grants are gone, but like the administrative state as a source of authoritative, comprehensive information is a subsidy to media organizations, right? Imagine if you had to build that on your own. So that resource is also gone. So that when we talk about the economic value that's being lost here, it's not the grant value alone. It's so many other services that are essential to an independent civil society even being economically viable in the first instance.
We have time for one more very brief and impactful question. Yes, sir.
Okay, I'll make it as brief as possible. Have you guys watched Loot, the TV series, which is about the foundation? But this, on the serious side, how close it is to what you guys doing? And on a more deeper side, I think along the lines all three of you mentioned how it's important to work with the grantees. The work is based on trust, not just aligning the goals, which goes beyond saying, but then the complexity is how do you guys onboard new grantees? And please don't give me the selection criteria. I believe they are on your websites. But like on a philosophical level, someone younger, especially in the context of what's happening in the world, they want to have a change, they want to work with you. How can they, become your grantee? Thank you.
Brief and impactful response.
I think, broadly speaking, people who have a compelling a vision of what they're trying to do and a really ruthless and rigorous idea of how to get there. I will say specifically, I think the best advice I can give to journalism grantees is based on my experience working with performing arts organizations. Organizations that walk in with a really strong argument about why the past continues to deserve the right to exist are not that compelling. Organizations that walk in talking about how the audience of the future will be different than the audience of the past, with fresh ideas about how to deliver the perennial values to that audience, are super compelling.
Thank you. That's all the time we have. Thank you, Kayce, Vidya, Sam, so much. I appreciate it.